The SNP have just suffered their largest ever revolt over the Gender Recognition Act, with 9 MSP SNP members actually refusing to allow the government in Holyrood to whip them into falling in line with the desires of a policy which has become so toxic and so corrosive. It's actually driving some people away from the focus of independence. So that's why I'm discussing it today. If you're thinking, you know, what the hell has it got to do with independence? I mean, a lot has happened since my last memorable trip to the Eagle, and in fact now I'm the Alba Party's women's convener, although my views might not necessarily fall in line with theirs, although I can't think that there'd be a problem, but obviously I'm saying that. Look, we women, that's those of us with a cervix, represent 51% of the country, and we gave birth to the other 49%. So I think that this issue on gender is very important. Now, you look like a bright lot. You do know that men have penises and women don't. Sorry to say this, but no, it's something genuinely that Nicola Sturgeon, Patrick Harvey, Sir Keir Starmer and a host of other political leaders are struggling with at the moment. None of them will answer a direct question about what a woman is. Should we be electing people to represent us in Holyrood and Westminster if they don't know what a woman is? I'm not sure how many of you were watching the news a few days ago, but the SNP Green Coalition ruling Holyrood these days refused a free vote to our MSPs during the gender recognition reform debate. I'm told that Labour and the Lib Dems also denied their MSPs a free vote. So these politicians were all whipped essentially and told how to vote. Well, as I said before, 9 politicians from the SNP refused to be whipped, and while 2 abstained, another 7 voted against the debate, which wants men to be able to self-identify as women without having to go through any medical expertise or certification. I'll come back to the nitty-gritty of that later, but in the meantime, the fallout remains to be seen from the debate, because the whip was not withdrawn from the heroic 9. If Nicola Sturgeon had done that, if she'd carried out her threat to withdraw the whip, she would have lost her majority in Holyrood. So despite the threats to their political careers, she didn't go ahead, which means that she's sort of lost that ultimate threat. You know, could she be now viewed as a lame duck in Holyrood? I really genuinely think, and it's not wishful thinking, I genuinely think this is the beginning of the end, folks, for Nicola. And her bonkers plan to reform the Gender Recognition Act. There are 5 stages that this reform has to go through, and last week saw the first stage. So if you work out the maths, if 9 have already had the guts to stand up and say no, that will then encourage their fellow MSPs to revolt at stage 2, stage 3. We might not even get to a stage 5. But now that the whip has not been withdrawn from the SNPs who revolted, it certainly means that others will be emboldened and stand up to the First Minister and her bullies. I'm not even sure, as I say, that these reforms will reach the fifth stage before the whole thing implodes, because as people find out exactly what it means, they're getting more and more angry.
You may be getting to this, but if you could explain a little more detail about what does actually mean and the...
Yeah, I will do. I want to name the 7, though, heroic MSPs, and if they are your MSPs, please write to them and say thank you. I think that they'll be under quite a bit of fire. The first one was Ash Reagan, who resigned from the post of Community Safety Minister just hours before Thursday's vote. And she said her conscience would not allow her to support the government plans. So she voted no, and she was joined by Stephanie Callaghan, Fergus Ewan, Kenneth Gibson, Ruth Maguire, John Mason, Michelle Thompson, and the 2 SNP abstainers were Annabel Ewing and Jim Fairley. And it took guts to do what they did. This showed incredible courage. Labour's Rosie Duffield, on the other side of the border, she's a Westminster MP, is equally courageous, and I want to mention her because about 2 or 3 years ago, Rosie Duffield was being hailed in the ranks of Labour for turning a centuries-old Tory seat from blue to red down south, but now, if you mention Rosie Duffield's name, people look the other way, they run the other way. She couldn't even get into the Labour Party conference. And that's because she blotted her copybook by stating only women have a cervix. When she was arguing that misogyny should be a hate crime, she was applauded and everybody was Team Rosie. Then she started talking about feminism and protecting women. By women, I mean adult females, those biological creatures in possession of a vagina and XX chromosomes. I know I'm insulting your intelligence, but this is, if somebody had said to me 5 years ago we'd be having this discussion, I'd say you're completely bonkers. But that is what we've been reduced to. Duffield has said her feminist and gender critical beliefs mean that while I've always fully supported the rights of all trans people to live freely as they choose, I do not accept self-ID as a passport for male-bodied biological men to enter protected spaces for biological women. And that is at the nub of this. I don't think anybody in this room could care less if a man chooses to wear a dress or not, or wants to call himself a woman or not. I don't think anybody would care. But if he then said, well, I have a right to go into woman-only spaces, I think a few of us would bristle at that. Nobody's saying trans women are sex pests, far from it. But there are sex predators out there who will take advantage of these self-ID laws. And Nicola Sturgeon says, well, we have laws to protect women. Is that before or after she's been raped? There's no reason to put any women or children at risk. Like many of us women who won't wished, Duffield has been called a transphobe and a homophobe for good measure. Starmer is still under pressure to withdraw the party whip. But of course, the climate is changing now, and I think these leaders are wishing that they hadn't gone down a particular path, and they're looking for a way back out. But what I find repugnant is the absence of Labour MPs rallying to Duffield's defence. What happened to the sisterhood when she was decrying misogyny? Labour's response is to do anything other than defend her, and Starmer's silence on the matter suggests he's quite happy that Duffield felt obliged to stay away from the party conference. And I think this is the attitude of the Scottish Labour leader as well, but trying to pin them down on this subject is like trying to nail jelly to the wall. The behaviour of these leaders is shameful. Under Starmer, under Sturgeon, under Sarwar, under Patrick Harvey. Patrick Harvey, I mean, he just hates women, full stop. And whoever's running the Lib Dems these days. The whole mob, full of their grand rhetoric of inclusion, diversity and feminism, are the same herd that bully and abuse women like me who stand up for women's rights. They're all clambering over each other like frogs in a bucket to reform the Gender Recognition Act to allow for gender self-identification. So when they come knocking on your doors, which inevitably they will at the next elections, whether it's council, Holyrood or Westminster, ask them about the GRA reforms and if it's fair that a trans woman can join a women-only candidate list. This is what we're wrestling with at the moment. The Scottish government says it simply wants to simplify the process of obtaining a gender recognition certificate, which will enable people to change their legal gender without the need to obtain a medical diagnosis. So if a man wants to declare himself to be a woman, he can. And similarly, if a woman wants to call herself a man, she can. It sounds simple enough, and some of you might be thinking, well, you know, what's the harm? There's nothing new about transsexuality. It goes back hundreds of years when it became accepted that folk could adopt gender identities different from their biological reality. But it has now become a toxic political hot potato, and it will bring down the SNP unless they wake up quickly. I was standing outside Holyrood with a lobby of women about this, and one of the women said, "This to me is more important than independence." I don't know. I tend to think that independence is the priority. But I just thought how frightening this is, that somebody is thinking about walking away from the independence battle and focusing on this. And this is why I'm talking about it now, because we have to get this legislation stopped, ripped up, thrown out, and focus on the real battle, whether it's in the courts, in Parliament, wherever it's going to be held. In fact, I have a feeling, and you might have a view on this, Ewan, that this may also end up in the Supreme Court. But this is what is focusing the mind of the SNP, this legislation, not independence, which seems to have taken a back seat, much to the frustration of decent people left within the party. If the Scottish government forges ahead with this gender madness, it will mean that anyone in Scotland can define themselves as a woman simply as a matter of choice, and in a matter of months, thus ignoring the biology. Again, you might think, well, what's the big deal? Well, it has serious implications for female-only spaces. We women need to have privacy from men in bathrooms, in changing rooms, health and beauty spas. I was talking to a beautician about it the other day, and she said, well, it doesn't really bother me and it doesn't affect me. I said, oh, really? I said, what if a trans woman comes into you for a Brazilian wax and they haven't been surgically, whatever it is, you know, a fully intact man? And she went, oh, no. And I said, you're being transphobic now, or that is how the argument will be. There's prisons as well where some of the most vulnerable women are. If a man wants to self-identify as a woman, and instead of going into a male prison, he could end up in a female prison. So there are issues of personal safety. And as I said before, no one's saying trans women are likely to be sex offenders, but there are male sex offenders and other predators who would see the opportunity and seize on the opportunity of gender self-identification as a route to accessing women-only spaces. We've already received reports of traumatized women and girls being sexually assaulted in gender-neutral changing rooms in department stores and shops. Primark has now decided just a few days ago to scrap its unisex changing rooms amid the growing backlash, because there have been reports of men dressed as women exposing their male genitalia to women and young girls in the changing room. Others have been reported of being sexually abused and molested by these men posing as women. Apart from the obvious physical threat to women, the Scottish Government has gone one step further by trying to erase the term women from its literature. And you can check yourself when you go back home tonight and have a look at the health literature, the government literature on the website. The term woman is hard to find anywhere. We've been erased. Apparently we're now called people who menstruate, pregnant people, abortion seekers, chest feeders, birthing parents. As I say, the term woman is being erased from Scottish Government official documents. I doubt very much if many voters would even have known about this had it not been for a few heroic feminists who have been fighting back over this clear erosion of the rights of women. It has hit the news lately because high-profile people like J.K. Rowling have stood up and said they've had enough. And she's had death threats and all sorts of nonsense and threats to her personal safety because of it. Court cases taken by individuals, such as a woman called Maya Forstater. She was up outside Holyrood the other week as well, joining in the lobby. She's been helpful in making it clear that gender-critical views are protected by freedom of speech and should be respected. But the UK and the Scottish governments and other governments around the world think that have in the past thought that they knew better. But the UK government is now rethinking its position. Other governments in Europe who once went down the route have all retreated from reforming the Gender Recognition Act to accept self-ID of gender. Everybody's changing their minds. Sadly, not the Scottish Government. It's still forging ahead with this madness. Astonishingly, Nicola Sturgeon says women's concerns about the reforms she is proposing are not valid. You know, she has the nerve to call herself a feminist down to her fingertips, and yet she says that my views, your views, not valid. It's unbelievable. Sadly, this arrogant and dismissive attitude and refusal to even just pause and reconsider reforms by Scotland's First Minister has led to bullying of gender-critical feminists by trans rights activists. And I happen to know that there are a number of trans women who are embarrassed by the aggression shown by trans rights activists. They're not doing any favours to their cause at all. More alarmingly, some of Sturgeon's own MSPs have been gagged, while some clinicians have been pushed into forcing vulnerable young people down irreversible routes as a consequence of this political pressure. In the last decade, there has been a mini explosion in the number of children, particularly teenage girls, who have developed gender dysphoria. It's a very real thing. They really think that they're living in the wrong sex. This belief of a mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity is leading to depression and anxiety, resulting in harmful personal impact. Tragically, many of these vulnerable young people have already been pushed down a pathway of transition, some being prescribed puberty blockers without fully realising the impact of early use of cross-sex hormones. This sort of medication can cause irreversible physical damage to young people's bodies, and now there's a growing number of detransitioners who've made irreversible changes to their bodies and they regret it. And they want to raise the issue. But the Scottish Government has shown a distinct lack of willing to listen to these people. We now know that parents of gender dysphoric children are told, look, you've got a choice. Either allow your child to transition or risk them committing suicide. There is this endlessly repeated figure of 48% of young trans people have attempted suicide. But according to journalist and author Helen Joyce, that figure is highly dubious and at best is based on the responses of 27 British trans people. That's what they've based this on. They're telling parents 48% of your children will commit suicide. And this is what it's based on, a poll of 27 people. It's a tiny self-selecting sample, and yet it has become the basis for wildly inaccurate political statements which have tumbled recklessly from the mouths of politicians who, quite frankly, should have done their research and should know better. Many female politicians in the Alba party, as well as other gender-critical men and women, have been bombarded with horrific online abuse. Yet despite all of this, Sturgeon and her Equality Secretary, Shona Robertson, will plough ahead with stage 2 of the bill, despite the concerns of many organisations, including the much respected Equality and Human Rights Commission. Ignoring all advice, it seems these two are determined to turn Scotland into a gender tourism destination to non-Scots who would only have to live here for 3 months and then they could apply to change their birth ID if this controversial legislation is allowed to go ahead, to abolish the need for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It would also cut the time in which someone must live in their acquired gender from 2 years to only a matter of months. If the Scottish Government continues on this disastrous route, it will display a lack of understanding on both the definition of a woman and the operation of the Equality Act. So now you know why women won't wished. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Yvonne. And so I'd like to open up in questions, comments, just, let the discussion evolve as it...
Could I start off with just a couple of comments, which I've been noting down while Yvonne was speaking. I was actually thinking that one of the things that is going on right now, and I saw it the other day, was that the police were looking for a person after someone had been sexually assaulted. They couldn't say that they were looking for a man. They said they were looking for a person. So it's, we're beginning to see that coming through already. Yvonne mentioned that this might end up in the Supreme Court. I think it probably will. Basically, Joanna Cherry's always writing about this. There are completely separate protected characteristics of sex and gender. It's as simple as that. And while they're unable to define a woman, actually, I've never yet seen a definition of gender either. I mean, gender really seems to be what people might make of it. And there just isn't a definition of gender, at least with sex. You've got the chromosome, there is science. And then, of course, people will say, well, the science can change. Yeah, of course, there's a principle of non-verifiability with science. It's the latest science is the correct version until someone proves it's wrong. But the correct version at the moment is that there are basically two sexes and it's chromosomal. But gender is no one's tried a definition of that. And I noticed, I was watching one of the committees in the Scottish Parliament dealing with this, and a very young woman, I'm sorry, I'm not decrying the fact that she's young, but she didn't have a huge amount of criminal court experience, I don't think, having never been in a criminal court. But she said, it's all right, there's an offence of making a false declaration. Now, if someone had come into my office and said they were accused of making a false declaration, I'd say, what's the declaration about? Well, I said I was a woman, and she said, well, why did you do that? He said, well, I felt like a woman that day. So you say it's not a false declaration. And you can't, the idea that anyone could actually be found guilty of this very curious crime of declaring themselves to be something that politicians say you can't define, it's completely and totally nuts. So I think this quite probably will go to the Supreme Court, either at the instance of, which is very unfortunate, a pressure group raising hard-earned money through crowdfunding to take a highly expensive challenge that really shouldn't be required, or possibly the UK government may take steps to challenge the legislation because of the cross-border issues, because I think the cross-border issues are just absolutely, we've seen it before, hundreds of years ago. People used to come to Gretna Green to get married because they could do it without their parents' consent. And then later they used to come to Scotland for a divorce because England didn't have divorce through the courts and Scotland did have. So you come up here for in those days you come up here for your sort of, your sexual liberation, one might say. And I can see something like this happening in future. The other thing, I just say that I believe there were 5 detransitioning women wanted to give evidence to the committee, and they refused. They said they didn't have time to listen to them, and then they said later that there was no evidence. So there's a complete dishonesty at a political level. So that's my comment.
Okay. Questions? Yep. Please, go ahead.
Does the panel foresee any detransitioners suing the Scottish Government in the future?
Well, there is legal action already being taken against a clinic in London, which has now been earmarked for closure, and that involves a sizable number of parents and detransitioners who feel as though they should have been given more counselling, and that the medical decisions taken were wrong. I mean, these blockers, puberty blockers, I don't know how many of you here can remember the Olympic gymnastic champion Olga Korbut, tiny little shrimp of a thing, amazing athlete. She was put on puberty blockers, and there was international outrage because she was kept trapped in this body. And some of the side effects of puberty blockers are infertility, and a whole range of lifelong ailments that need medication. And you know, there has to be, I think, a more common sense approach taken to try and help these young people. And I think one of the things that has upset lesbians in particular is that young girls who are feeling attracted to other young girls think that, oh gosh, I'm in the wrong body, I should be a man. When in fact, through some basic counselling, they would realise that there's nothing wrong with them. They're just physically attracted to the same sex. And unfortunately, some of these young girls have been pushed down the transitioning route. And this is why you have clashes and women like Joanna Cherry standing up saying that this sort of self-IDing is dangerous.
Please.
Try and tie both things up here, because if there's not an ISP person or an Alba person standing in my region, I will not vote SNP because of the women's issue. But this is where we come back to Salvo. How do we hold these people accountable to what they're doing to our country and pulling the independents into?
I might just add a comment here. Just thinking just now, I don't want to tell you lots and lots of stories about who used to come to student parties, but I remember being at a student party in about 1967, something like that, many years ago. And a funny wee guy came, and he was Anthony J.C. Kerr. I don't know if anyone know who I'm talking about. He was a wee fellow. He was in motorcycle leathers, and he had he was all dressed up. He'd actually arrived on a motorbike from, I think, Hoyk, and how he ever managed to drive himself home. He left about 3 o'clock in the morning, but he'd gone there for a purpose, and it was to tell. A lot of these events were really very, very political. And he said, I'm really quite right-wing. I said, I'm a kind of Scottish nationalist Tory. And he said, I will work with Marxists and communists and Labour Party people to get Scottish independence. And he said that the minute independence is achieved, and this is quite high up in the SNP in the 1960s, he said, we will immediately dissolve. He said, we're not interested in policies. We're not interested in doing, we're not interested in whether you want nationalisation or anything. We disagree with each other on all these issues. We just want independence. And that just sort of triggered my brain just now, because the way I see this gender thing is, what the hell has it got to do with independence? Why does it become so incredibly important to some of these people? And why I didn't vote for Emma Roddick on the Highlands and Islands list. I live in Argyll, by the way, because I had Andy Whiteman to vote for, because he'd left the Green Party over the gender issue. And I thought, well, maybe Andy's got a chance. Well, he didn't have a chance because people up there didn't know him. But Emma puts out tweets saying, you all voted for this. No, we didn't. And we didn't. we voted. Anyone that voted for her voted for independence, and it wasn't even in the manifesto. So I mean, what I'm really saying is, I'm really kind of. There is a really important point here. What are they going to get sidetracked with next? Now, slightly less visible than that, I actually don't like their economic policies. I think that if we started looking at, if we actually took the trouble to kind of just work out what the hell do these people really stand for. I mean, they've got a guy that's the Duke of Buccleuch's factor basically writing economic policies for them. Wait a minute. This is absolutely ridiculous. People aren't going to, if people really knew, I mean, they vote SNP because they want independence, and then they get gender, they'll get massive privatisation, they're getting the offshore wind sold off. You just wait for it. What's going to come down the road next?
And Murray Foote as the chief media advisor, former head of the Daily Record.
It's quite scary. So there was a lot of sense in what that old guy, Anthony J.C. Kerr, said all those years ago. Yeah.
It is like playing whack-a-mole while we're sort of on this road to independence, and we're all trying to focus on independence, and these things are cropping up. But some of them it's too dangerous just to not, to ignore them.